some of Bibi's recent comments. He went back to this, we are the people of the light, they are the people of the darkness, saying we're going to realize the prophecy of Isaiah, cribbing from David Frum with the axis of evil nonsense. Isaac Herzog, as I was saying before, saying there are no innocent civilians. Like, they're not shy about explaining exactly how they view this conflict. And so one thing I've appreciated about your analysis is you've been really clear about how all of this attempt by, people like Joe Biden, other liberals in the Democratic Party, Bernie, much to my grave disappointment, to put a bit of a nicer face on it and say, please watch out for the laws of war, and please, consider the civilians, and they're not all Hamas. We're not going to actually do anything to make sure that you don't continue committing the war crimes you're already committing, but we're going to pretend that we're, wringing our hands about this and we're so concerned. And you've in particular been clear about the difference between what, Biden and Bernie and Tony Blinken are calling for, which is a quote unquote humanitarian pause, versus what actually needs to be done, which is a complete ceasefire. I'd love for you to lay out those distinctions and why, because an MSNBC viewer, just sort of like, general person out there who isn't following that closely might hear humanitarian pause and think, okay, that sounds pretty good. Like, why are we beating up on him for that? What is your response?
Well, my response is, which is, again, I have a piece in The Nation coming out Friday, so I think this will come out around the same time, so I won't be scooping myself. Not that it really matters, because it's more important to get the talking points across, is that the humanitarian pause is a made-up thing. And what's important to know is that this is not something that anyone is calling for. A loose network of all of Palestinian civil society is calling for a ceasefire. The UN has called for a ceasefire. It's humanitarian, or it's human rights agency. Oxfam, this morning, Amnesty International, which is quite extraordinary. Amnesty International doesn't usually deliberately call for ceasefires. They don't call against or for war usually. So it's actually pretty extraordinary that Amnesty International will call for a ceasefire. Polls show 80% of Democrats support a ceasefire, 60% of Republicans, the majority, therefore, of voters support a ceasefire. The vast majority of countries in the world support a ceasefire in the UN. The US had to veto that at the Security Council, as they've been doing for Israel for many decades. So the ask very uniformly is centering around, and obviously these millions of people at protest and Jewish peace activists in the US and Palestinian activists. Groups like If Not Now, groups like Win Without War finally came out after they got bullied into it, because they tried to do some half-ass humanitarian pause thing or follow human rights concern trolling. So you have 80% of Democrats, voters, according to polls, support a ceasefire, yet less than 5% of Democrats elected support it. This is the ask. The ask is to stop the fucking bombing, not to do what many suspect a humanitarian pause is, because it's kind of a term invented in a whiteboarding session that probably, my guess is, CAP or J Street is where this is coming from. And this says stop bombing in this particular spot so we can bring in humanitarian aid. I guess we'll bring in some water, and then we're going to allow Israel to just go back to bombing you after we give you water. It's absurd. It doesn't make any sense. For anything to happen, the ask needs to be to stop the bombing. But the word from the White House and the Democratic establishment and the pro-Israel groups out there is you have to let Israel do its thing. It needs to get whatever plan it needs to, quote unquote, eradicate Hamas or free the hostages or whatever kind of thin moral narrative they're providing it, that, again, I don't think are very credible, because I don't think if they really wanted to free the hostage, they would be doing what they're doing, which is largely bombing hostages. I also don't think they would be. I think the idea of eradicating Hamas is a bit of a fantasy, because I think the ground invasion is we can just discuss whether or not that's going to happen, but there doesn't really seem to be a goal other than just administering collective punishment, or in some cases, basically creating a buffer zone, which is to say cleansing northern Gaza of Palestinians, removing them all to the desert in very South Gaza or into the Sinai, if they can bribe Egypt enough. And that's really their goal, and that we need to create space for that. And you cannot undermine the White House by calling for a ceasefire, because that's a specific thing with a specific meaning, which is to say stop bombing. Stop bombing these people in Gaza who have nothing to do with what happened on October 7th, who are just fucking random people. And they needed to create space for Israel to go, again, to do its Bronze Age recompense. And in doing so, They need to provide space and cover for Democrats who don't want to look like cold-hearted monsters and don't want to look like they're supporting, because again, these horrific images are coming out every day. Children being pulled out of rubble, disfigured, all this horrific stuff, right? People can see that, and they know Joe Biden's associated with that. And of course, Genocide Joe is alliterative. It's catchy. And again, one doesn't want to be glib about this, but that is in fact what's going on. That is the reality of what's going on. This is not like a made-up, nihilistic, Russia Today thing. This is like a real thing that's happening, and Biden is actually responsible for it, and he needs to stop being responsible for it. And so they have to provide these kind of stop, measure, gaps. And so initially what you saw from people like Elizabeth Warren and Ro Khanna was this: Israel needs to respect the rules of war. We need to reduce civilian casualties, and we need to, maybe they'd say turn the water back on, which is obviously better than no water, but it's like, well, 90% of the thing causing their death and misery is the bombs. Why are you not talking about stopping the bombs from landing on them? That is obviously the most morally urgent ask. And anyone who isn't within the Democratic machine or kind of political milieu knows that, which is why they're all calling for a ceasefire. Only people who are loyal to the Democratic Party and the White House and those who are either are ideologically or financially aligned with these pro-Israel organizations, they intuitively know this is ridiculous, that this is obscene, that this is immoral, what we're doing right now. It's obvious to anyone with two eyes, which is why 80% of Democrats want a fucking ceasefire, right? You only have to be completely steeped in racist tropes and ideology to believe that this is at all proportional or reasonable or morally sound. And so they need to create space and they need to create time. And the way you do that is by coming up with half-assed solutions. And thus far, and this is what made the Bernie Sanders call for a humanitarian pause, again, something that no one's asking for, no Palestinian group, no peace group, not Oxfam, not the UN, not Doctors Without Borders. They're all calling for a ceasefire. Humanitarian pause is not a word I've seen in any of their press releases, just a thing they made up in some blob thing they made up in a whiteboarding session 5 minutes ago. Was extremely disappointing because Sanders knows better. Again, he's surrounded by, CAP guys and Center for American Progress, these kind of, ladder climbers, not to sort of absolve him of his responsibility. He knows what he's doing. He's always been dicey on Israel, but he's been saying things lately, especially about Netanyahu, that have indicated that, clearly he's breaking with the sort of bog standard AIPAC line, but, not here. And I think it's going to be a stain on his legacy. I think this moment in time will be a stain on a lot of people's legacy. I think that any kind of response that would have been viewed as being comported to protecting civilian life or international law pretty much became obviously not going to happen within about 10 minutes of Israel's response. So I don't know what the fuck they're talking about. When you see people like Ro Khanna say, well, we really need to respect, and Israel needs to respect human rights law. And I'm like, what fucking planet do you live on? Do you know what Israel's been doing to Palestine for the last 75 years, much less last 20 years? When have they ever followed international law? The occupation itself is in violation of about a half a dozen international laws. So when you come along and you do this hand wringing and you're asking for this boutique targeted, Zach Beecham did this at Vox, here's how Israel needs to respond. It needs to be nicer. And it's like, yeah, but that's not happening in reality. In the fucking time, space, three-dimensional world we live in, that is not what's actually happening. So why don't you stop to ask the bombs that are actually happening rather than politely suggesting a bombing that is never going to happen?
Is the disconnect ideological, or is it financial, or is it both? Because there is a huge disconnect between normal people and what's going on in DC.
A lot of people are racist and just don't view Palestinians as human beings, or view them all as kind of terrorist or proto-terrorist. I mean, a lot of people are just fucking racist. A lot of it is venality. A lot of people have expressed concern about groups like AIPAC and even J Street has said they're going to punish people who came out in support of a ceasefire. I think they may have eased off on that a little bit, but initially they were making calls to quote unquote, to progressives and liberals in Congress saying, if you support a ceasefire, we are going to go after you. And so it's
well, and if I could just interject, I mean, Democrats in the House in the House and the Senate, they have the very recent example of Democratic Majority for Israel, DMFI, coming in with a lot of money against Summer Lee and against Nina Turner and a bunch of against a bunch of people.
They funded all the anti-Sanders ads in 2020 in Iowa, or rather in South Carolina and Nevada.
Exactly. So they've seen what this can do to a campaign, and they're terrified of it, and they have no moral spine, and there are approximately $0.0 to be made and political benefit to be gained from, calling for the ceasefire.
But that's all it takes. Like, there's literally a genocide going on, and that's all it takes to get them to stop.
I was listening to Ryan Grimm talk about Fetterman in particular, who has been so bad, and going out of his way to be horrible.
Just being gratuitous and cruel and race baity in a way that was really cynical. Really
exactly.
cynical.
And Ryan's analysis was basically like, he wanted to keep this PAC out of his race in his primary against Connor Lamb. And so he just basically was like, tell me what you want me to say in his Senate campaign. And now he's just like sticking to it. He's just decided to lean into it. And so, I mean, that does shape a lot of the political dynamics here, which is how you can get, and I'd love you to speak specifically to this, we got our new speaker, yay, great. And their first act was to pass this resolution, again, reaffirming, Israel, do whatever you want. It's fine. We've got your back no matter what. And also a bunch of kind of belligerent language against Iran as well. And there are only 10 people who voted against that. So, I mean, you're basically, you're co-signing these theoretical war crimes, these things that are happening right now. You're saying, yes, we are with you. We agree with it 100%.